Hello again. We are going to share more of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind by William Kamkwamba and Brian Mueller. And we're doing so with permission from the publisher, Puffin Books, and we are very grateful for that. So the last time we read a couple developments, William started going to school and then had to discontinue going because his family did not have enough money to cover the fees. Or they had enough money to cover the fees, but just the fees, and they wouldn't have been able to afford many of the other necessities for the rest of the family for the remainder of the year. And also, it's finally harvest time. Today, we are going to share pages 173 to 186. So let's begin. Once harvest was over, I was able to return to the scrapyard to collect pieces for my windmill. Walking through the tall grass, I'd see something interesting, pick it up and think, what on earth is this? Only to spot something even better a second later. One day, while poking through the weeds, I found what looked like a four-wheel drive differential. The gears that send power to the wheels and allow the vehicle to turn. I managed to pry off the casing with my screwdriver and discovered globs of black engine grease. Every machine needs grease, I thought. I scooped it out into a plastic bag and stuck it in my pocket. That same day, I found a handful of cotter pins left inside a discarded hubcap. Those are like split pins. They kind of look like bobby pins, like you'd put in your hair. I collected bits of wire, plus some things I'd probably never use. Brake pedals, a broken gear stick, and the crankshaft from a small engine. I took them all home anyway. Early on, I realized that one of my biggest, most important pieces, a bicycle, had been sitting under my roof from the start. My father's broken bike had been leaning against the wall of the living room for over a year, collecting dust and dirty laundry. It had no handlebars, only one wheel, and its frame was rusted as anything in the scrapyard. I'd offered to repair it many times, but my father always gave the same answer. There's just no money. One day, I finally gathered the courage to ask him if I could use it for my windmill. I sat him down and explained the entire process, how the bike frame would make the perfect body and be sturdy enough to handle strong winds. I described how the wind and blades would act as pedals to spin the wheel and power the generator. Electricity, I said, spreading my arms like a magician. Water! My father just shook his head. Son, please don't break my bike. I've already lost so many radios. Besides, one day, we'll use that thing. Use it for what, I thought? To ride 5 miles to buy kerosene for the lanterns that make us all sick when you could have lights for free? Oh, it took so long to convince my father to give up that piece of junk. I must have begged for an hour. I have a plan, I persisted. Allow me to try. Just think, we could have lights, we could pump water, and have extra harvest. We'll never go hungry again. He considered this a while, then finally gave in. Okay, perhaps you're right, but please don't mess it up. I grabbed the bicycle and hurried into my room, where I leaned it against the wall with my other materials. Standing back, I realized how my room had come to resemble the scrapyard itself. All of my windmill pieces, the bicycle, tractor fan, shock absorber, and bearings, sat in a picture-perfect row, like in a museum. The rest of the floor, however, was covered with random greasy bits that spilled under the bed and piled behind the door. The room smelled like the inside of a transmission. You never know what you might need, I reasoned. Of course, I forbade my sisters from even entering my room to sweep and mop. I was certain they didn't appreciate the value of a used muffler clamp or water pump. Who knows what they might sweep into the dustbin? But Mama told us to clean, they yelled through the door. I'll tell you when it's time, I answered. I'm busy. When I wasn't in the scrapyard, I hung out at the library or sat in my hammock and read. At this point, my father felt so bad about my schooling that he no longer forced me to work in the fields. This made my sisters jealous. Why does William get to stay home and not us? Doris asked my father one day. Is it because he's a boy and we're girls? If he's staying home, so are we. William has a project, my father said. And if he's really wasting time, he'll be proven wrong eventually. You girls just worry about yourselves. With my father's blessings, I spent mornings and afternoons planning my windmill. I pored over chapters about electricity and explaining physics. I learned how it moves and behaves and how it can be harnessed. I reviewed sections on home wiring, parallel circuits versus series circuits, and more stuff on AC and DC currents. Back at the library, I renewed the same book. I renewed the same 3 books over and over until one day, Miss Sekolo raised her eyebrows. William, are you still preparing for exams? What are you up to? Oh, just building something, I said. You'll see. More and more, going to the scrapyard began to replace school in my mind. It was an environment where I learned something new each day. I'd see strange and foreign materials and try to imagine their use. One thing looked like an old compressor, or perhaps it was a landmine. I found real compressors and shook them to hear the pieces rattling inside. Then I would pry them open and investigate. My imagination was constantly at work. Sometimes I pretended to be a great mechanic, crawling on my back under the rusted cars with the tall grass clutching me in its arms. I shout up to a customer, "Start it up, let's see how she sounds. Give it a gas, don't be shy. Whoa, whoa, that's too much." If the engine didn't sound right, I'd give it to them straight. "Looks like you're gonna need an overhaul." I know, it's expensive, but that's life." I pretended to shout to my other mechanics who were slacking as usual. "Feary, today you're doing the oil changes." Do you remember who Feary is? Mr. Feary, the headmaster of school? "Yes, boss," he'd reply. Another mechanic walked over shaking his head. Problems again. "Mr. Kamkwamba, boss, we can't fix this car. We've tried everything, but it still makes a noise. What do you think?" "Start it up. Yes. Injector pump." "Thank you, sir. For sure." I climbed atop the tractors, pressed the ignition button with my foot, and pretended to drive. Adam, you're out of my way. Your man Kamkwamba must work." In my mind, I dug ridges in my field, making up for all the days I'd swung a hoe in the sun. Each time I wished one of those tractors would actually fire up and move. If it did, I'd drag the whole scrapyard home. But no matter how much fun I had, my mood didn't last long. The students across the street at Cachacolo could see me banging away on various things. If I wasn't careful, they could even hear me talking to myself. A few times while carrying out my pieces, some kids in the playground cried, "Hey look, it's William, digging in the garbage again." The first time it happened, I walked over and tried to explain the windmill, but the kids, they just laughed. Even days when I tried sneaking past, someone would spot me through the open window and shout, "There goes the crazy guy." Luckily, I did have a few supporters. But Jeffrey had been hired by our uncle to work at the maize mill in Chipumba, and that meant that Gilbert was the only person I could trust. Finally, I decided that whenever someone shouted, "William, what are you doing in the garbage?" I'd just smile and say nothing. Of course, the students at Cachacolo told their parents about the lunatic in the scrapyard, and soon my mother was getting an earful at the trading center. Now when I came home with my pieces, she stared at me and just shook her head. One day, she barged into my room looking worried. "What's wrong with you?" she said. "Your friends don't behave this way. I mean, look at this room. It looks like a madman's room. Only madmen collect garbage." That night, she complained to my father. How is he ever going to even find a wife like this? How is he going to care for her family? "Leave the boy alone," my father said. "Let's see what he has up his sleeve." Over the next few weeks, the treasures kept revealing themselves like pieces of a magic puzzle. When I realized I needed more PVC pipe, Gilbert allowed me to dig up the drainage pipe from the floor of his bathhouse. He didn't bother asking his father, who was not too happy the next morning. Once the pipe was cleaned and dry, I cut it down the middle with my bow saw. I melted it over the fire until it bubbled and curled, then rolled it off and pounded it flat. I then cut 4 blades, each measuring 4 feet in length. Okay, so probably about yay big. I wanted to go ahead and connect the blades to my tractor fan, but I had no nuts and bolts. I spent the next 2 weeks in the scrapyard turning over every machine and piece of metal, but I only had the box end wrench, and it was too large for most of the bolts I found. Many were so rusted they stripped against the tool or refused to budge. I told this pathetic story to Gilbert one afternoon, and right away he offered to help. His father sometimes gave him money for working in their fields. That day, Gilbert walked to Mr. Dowd's shop with 50 kwacha and bought a sack full of screws and bolts and nuts, all the perfect size for my windmill. I was so grateful. What a good friend Gilbert is. But I still had a problem. The metal pieces needed to be welded together to ensure that they would hold. We had no welding machine at home, and to hire a welder cost more money. I was stalled again. So welding is what you need to do to hold 2 pieces of metal together. Okay? Then one day in the trading center, I got lucky. I was playing Bawo with some friends when a man pulled up in a dump truck. He was from Kasungo and needed boys to help load some wood. "I'll pay 200 kwacha for the job," he said. I ran over waving my arms. "I'll do it, I'll do it!" He motioned me into the truck along with 10 other guys. I spent all afternoon throwing logs under the sun, tired, sweaty, and with the biggest grin on my face. With 200 kwacha, I could pay a welder for the first phase of work, connecting the shock absorber shaft to the bicycle bottom bracket. That way it could spin the crankset and chain and move the wheel. I also needed him to melt holes in the metal blades of the tractor fan so that I could bolt on the bigger PVC blades. Mr. Godston's shop was in the trading center under a grass-covered shelter. He used an electric welding box. It was ancient-looking and made from wood, and it plugged into the wall of his home with a long, patched-together cord. A crowd of people usually gathered around to watch him weld, myself included. The men would discuss the particular project while the boys played in the shower of sparks that shot from his gun. Even though I had money for the job, Godston laughed when I walked up carrying my pieces. "You want me to weld a broken shock absorber to a bicycle with 1 wheel?" he asked, mocking me. Others in the crowd joined in. "Ah, look, the madman has come with his garbage. We've been hearing about you." He's not a man, just a lazy boy who plays with toys and refuses to work. He's misala. That means crazy. My face grew hot. I was so tired of hearing those words. "That's right," I said. "I'm lazy, misala, whatever you want to call me. But I have a plan, and I know what I'm doing. Soon you will all see." I then turned to Godston, and I gave him the dead eye. "And to answer your question, mister," I said, "you heard me right. Weld the shock absorber to the bicycle, and make sure it's not crooked." When Godston was finished, I paid him my money and took the bicycle home. I returned it to its place in my room and started laughing. It really did look like a madman's creation. The shock absorber jutted from the crankset like a strange robotic arm, its joints fused with melted metal. Next to it, my blades leaned against the wall like giant insects' wings. Their white surfaces scorched and bubbled like a burnt marshmallow. The tractor fan looked like a super Chinese throwing star, one that would slice through the darkness, leaving a trail of light. I couldn't wait to put them all together. But once again, I was missing something, and it was a big something. I needed a generator. But where in the world was I going to find such an expensive thing? I could wait and try to earn 500 kwacha to buy the dynamo in Dowd's shop, but that could take forever. The owner of the dry goods store had hired a permanent team of workers to unload his trucks, and jobs loading wood came only so often. So I went back to the scrapyard. I spent the next 3 weeks sifting through the grass like a bomb-sniffing dog, turning over every piece of metal in hopes of uncovering a generator I may have missed, or at least an alternator. Hadn't I seen several of those? Well, it turned out that I wasn't the only one looking for such things. Some younger boys from the trading center had also discovered the importance of electric motors. But instead of using them for science, they were just stripping out the wire to build toy trucks. I caught them one day as I entered the yard. I shouted, "Hey you!" But they took off running. Maybe they'd heard the stories about the madman and feared for their lives. Anyway, when I got to where they'd been standing, I found a perfectly good motor, stripped of its wires. It lay there dead in the grass like one of those poached elephants missing its tusks. I began to fear my windmill would never get built. Worse, over the next month, it seemed like every dynamo in central Malawi came out to taunt me. I saw them on bicycles everywhere, and most of the time they were broken, not even attached to a light bulb. I think, God, what a waste. Give it to me and I'll show you how to use it. Others worked perfectly and shot fat beams of light down the dark roads at night. I never had the courage to flag down the owners. What would I say? Instead, I woke up each morning to the pile of metal in my room, then went and helped my father in the fields. At night, the windmill pieces were easier to look at since everything disappeared in the dark. So think about that for a minute. Everything disappears in the dark because William doesn't have the luxury that we have of switching on the lights so that you can see at night. One Friday in July, Gilbert and I were walking home from the trading center and I was feeling glum. "How's the windmill going?" he asked. "I have everything, but still no generator," I said. "If I had that, I could build it tomorrow. I'm afraid this dream will never come true." "Oh, sorry, friend." Just then we saw a guy pushing his bike. I didn't know him, but he was around our age, and as he passed, I looked down, and I noticed a familiar glitter by his tire. "And look," I said, "another dynamo." But this time, I wasn't afraid. I ran over to the guy and asked if I could see his bike. I bent down and gave the pedal a good spin, and when I did, the headlamp, an old car bulb, it flickered on. Gilbert turned to him. "How much to buy the dynamo?" he asked. "No, Gilbert, I don't have any." "How much?" Gilbert said again. The guy refused at first, but finally gave in. No one was foolish enough to refuse money at this time. 200 kwacha, he said, with the bulb. "I still have some money from my father," Gilbert told me. "Let's use it to buy the dynamo. Let's finish the windmill." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 200 kwacha, 2 red paper notes. After some messing around to get the dynamo and the bulb off the bike, I was holding them in my hand. "Gilbert," I said, "thank you very much. You are the greatest friend I've ever had." While Gilbert went home, I ran back to my room and placed the dynamo with the other materials, adding the last piece of the puzzle. The moment I laid it down, a magnificent gust of wind blew open my door and spun a cyclone into the room. It whipped up the windmill pieces in its arms and revealed the finished machine, its blades spinning wildly through the blur of red dust. Or maybe that was only a dream. So a couple things to consider after reading this section. Why do you think the other children called William crazy? And why are Gilbert's actions so meaningful, especially at this point in the book? So consider those two things, and we'll meet again soon to read.